Welcome to the Crafting Character Podcast. Steve Carter here, and I am so excited. I feel like I start this podcast every episode by saying that, but truly I am. And in association with my good friends at CDF Capital and my friends at Food for the Hungry, I love these conversations because we get to talk with pastors who want to get better at the craft of communication, but we always want to be the kind of people where our character leads the way. And throughout kind of this season, there are times when I will have a book come across my desk or it's recommended and I will read it and I just know this is somebody, if they will say yes, we need to have on the Crafting Character Podcast. And a few episodes ago, I interviewed Chuck DeGroat and he told me about this book, Try Softer. And he told me about the author, Aundi Kolber, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go because whatever Chuck says, I do. And I literally went to Barnes & Noble, loved the cover, bought the book, read it in one setting, began to follow Aundi on Instagram, and I reached out and she graciously said yes. And so, Aundi, I am so excited. I literally am so excited because I feel like I've told you this, but in 2020, when I read your book, this was hands down top three books that I read of all of last year. Maybe it was because of how crazy 2020 was. Maybe it was because I am just naturally hard on myself, but I felt like Try Softer gave such profound language to it's just a healthier, more holistic, kinder way to live. And so welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to talk about your book. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm doing well. It's really good to be with you.
Well, tell me a little bit about the book. Try Softer is such a great title, but where did this idea come from for you? And especially, we're talking to pastors who are communicators. And I think often our language sometimes is a little bit harsher, a little bit stronger. But Try Softer, give us a little backstory of why this title and the heart behind the book.
Yeah. Well, I love just from the start, I love that you're naming how important language is because I think that really matters. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of that. But I think for me, some of the story behind this is that I'm a survivor of complex trauma from my childhood. And the big picture idea is that I learned to survive and cope by doing what I call white knuckling it.
Wow.
And that, there's a lot to that. There's so much we could unpack, but the idea behind it is that when it's not safe to exist as who we really are, we learn to push past what we can really do. And our body, there's physiological consequences to that. We have to go up into either our sympathetic nervous system or we have to go down into what's called our dorsal vagal, which would be sort of like a freeze response. And so I spent a lot of my life either on the cusp of almost going into that sort of fight or flight. And sometimes there's another response called fawning, or going down into sort of a dissociative place. And so this was my story. This is my story. I lived a lot of my life like that. And I didn't think there was anything abnormal about that. I thought that's maybe what it meant to be a person. I thought I didn't know anything different. I had an inkling that things in my family weren't the way they should be, but I didn't have language. I didn't have a picture of how things could be different. And so as I got older and I went to, I got my undergrad degree and then I, kind of moved in a direction to wanting to really help people. I became a therapist. And at that point though, I didn't have a good understanding even then of the amount of trauma, particularly what's called either relational trauma, interpersonal trauma, within my family, particularly, one of my parents was terrifying for me. And so that has profound effects on how it shapes our body, our nervous system. So all that leads me to, I graduated, I'm a therapist. I had this really gentle and just very wise supervisor because I was a young therapist, just early on. And I was sharing with him this sense of, I cared so much about my clients, but it was like, it was too much caring. It was like, I was caring. I was losing myself in what I was doing. I was trying so hard to be a good therapist. I wanted to help so badly. And I remember, his name was John, and he was so kind and so grounded, like his settled, that feeling when you're with someone where you feel more settled because you're with them. And he said to me one day, he said, Aundi, you're doing a really good job. You care so much about your clients, and I'm so proud of you. But I wonder what it would be like instead of trying so hard if you tried softer. And, that it hit me profoundly. I wish I could say it was like flipping a switch, and then from then on, I tried softer. That'd have been great. But it wasn't that. At the time, what first hit me was actually I felt a little bit angry because I was like, well, that sounds great, John. Wouldn't it be nice if we could all try softer? Like who's going to get everything done? But there was this other part of me that was like, wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't it be nice if I didn't have to work so hard?
Those moments of exhale, when you know that there's truth, you don't necessarily know how to access it and implement it fully, but you know that there's something sacred and holy about that. You mentioned this feeling of wanting to help so badly your clients. And I think there's so many pastors who feel that, they get in and they want to help. They want to help with their words. They want to help in pastoring people through difficult moments, and they can lose themselves, and they can kind of lose that grounding. And just a second ago, you mentioned fight or flight. You mentioned another one, freeze, but you also mentioned fawning. I think for most people, they might not know what that means. Is there a connection between fawning and losing yourself?
Great question. Yep. So fawning, I'll just say this really quick, was a phrase coined by a therapist named Pete Walker. Okay. And it was first from his book on complex trauma. And so I just to give him, a shout out there, but so it's a relatively new idea within the trauma world. And it's still, to be honest, I think there's more research that's really needed. Even sometimes I think it's not always recognized, but even just based off of my lived experience and then my experience with my clients, I'm like, oh no, this is a thing. This is a real thing. And so it makes sense because Pete Walker is a survivor of complex trauma. And I find that oftentimes people with some of that lived experience combined with that training can really speak into some things that are not always recognized. But going back to your question, fawning is an adaptive response, meaning that it's not like animals don't have this response. Mammals don't fawn. Okay. So this is a learned response that we begin to, over time, we learn to assess situations. And if we perceive that there's a threat for any reason, sometimes we're not even assessing it correctly. And a lot of times that's because of old trauma.
Right.
If we assess a situation, like if I don't give this person, if I don't overly attend to this person, there is going to be really bad consequences. So for me and my family, that was totally my story. Like I learned, like one of my main trauma responses is fawning. It was this learned adaptive behavior. And what's interesting about this behavior is that it can blend different nervous system states. So we're still connected a little bit to what's called our window of tolerance, just a little bit. But it's like we're like on that trajectory of leaving ourselves. It's kind of like I've got one toe in, and that's what allows me to look at your body language and read your cues. But at the same time, I'm bringing this hypervigilance. Like, what do you need? What do you want? What do you like? Where do you want to go? And this is what is meant by leaving ourselves.
Wow.
Because I think when we are, really the goal, for example, for me as a therapist, is when I'm in a session with someone, it's almost like we're trying to allow our attention and our energy dance between you and then to me. And it's not something that I'm speaking about. I'm just experiencing in my body that I'm like with myself. I can notice that, my shoulders are starting to get a little tense, or, my breathing's getting a little quicker. Like that's a cue that maybe I'm starting to over attend to the person I'm with. And to some, it's like, and this is where it can sometimes get confusing with faith, because I think sometimes we're taught this is what it means to be really loving. Wow. Is that you do lose yourself, that you do deny, that I think we've got confused what it means to deny ourselves. And for me, what I go back to from a faith standpoint is that Jesus calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves. Like as we love ourselves, this is how I want to love you. Yes. And that means that if I'm ignoring myself, if I'm shaming myself, if I'm suppressing myself, what kind of world does that create for my neighbor? Because if we take that to the fruition of what that would mean, it doesn't make any sense. And it would be harmful, right? And so there's this sense of that, there's times for us to really sacrificially love other people, but that has to come from a place of being with, like, I am choosing to give you this gift, not because I'm afraid, but because I want to, because I am loved, because I have what I need, because I, as a person, am valuable. And therefore I can allow my attention to dance and say, okay, what do you need? What do I need? What do you need? What do I need? And so for those of us who've been in systems, who've been in families, even culturally, I think this can be a thing. We can get this really, just a view that's not correct of what that means to be present with other people. And so fawning is different than caring. Yes. Because if I'm afraid, like if I have to give you what you want because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't, that's not healthy. It's not. And it's actually, there's maybe signs there that there could be, abuse or toxicity or other elements involved.
It's so helpful. I mean, and that really gives, such language, and especially when you talk about this self-care, this self-love, like what we're actually able to give to our neighbor. And, I think of like my own childhood. My dad went through a massive transformation towards the ends of his life, thanks be to God. And, but he had a lot of anger, and I learned how to walk on eggshells. And he'd come in and he worked in LA, and he'd open up his briefcase every night when he, came home, and there was a loaded 357 in there, and so you kind of learn to know what he was feeling. And I would always say, before he met Jesus, there was like three things he'd say to me, something wise, something funny, or he would cuss me out. So I could tell by the way he walked what dad I was going to get. And so if it was angry dad, it was grab my basketball when I get home and flee as fast as I could. If it was funny dad, it was like, okay, try to keep it going so that like I protect myself from him actually getting angry. Don't mess up. But sometimes I had no language for your body keep score. I had no language to listen to your body. I had no understanding of the incarnation outside of Jesus came, but not like what's happening within me. But the anxiety, the fear, the second guessing, all of that. And yet the craziest piece of it is I learned how to read a room and I learned how to read people. So now as a pastor, it's this weird spot. Like I can read people, but I couldn't even read myself.
Mm-hmm. So indicative of that fawn.
Exactly. And as you were saying that, I was like, this is so crazy. I learned this ability to see another and for my own survival, make sure that they're good. But it was almost shameful and shame-filled to even consider what was happening in little Steve or in 20-something Steve, in 30-something Steve, and I think what makes that tricky, and it's curious when you talk about your story, but you discovered a lot of this while you're actually seeing clients. And I think one of the reasons pastors often resist self-love is Sunday's coming. I got to get up in front of people. So how did you practice trying softer when you actually had a whole way, a homeostasis, if you will, like a familiar way, but now you're having to try it on and practice it in front of real people?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, especially given the context of what you're saying. I know, there's pastors who may be listening to this and that might feel like a block or resistance to something like this. And I think for me, there's several things that have come out of my work in terms of, because I'd say it's been about 12 years of just really leaning in. And I mean, it doesn't mean like, I don't know. It's just been this process and it's an ebb and flow. And sometimes it's circular and I'm like, didn't I already deal with this? There are layers. So I just say that. And I think for me, one of the big things that I would want to just start with is that I think we have been socialized to believe in our culture that what we do is who we are. Wow. Right? So what your sermon is, how many people are at your church, for me, it's like, how many clients do you have? How well is your book doing? Whatever, there's all these things, right? And it's not to say that those things don't affect us. Obviously they do, right? But what's so cool about this work, and the thing that for me is always the invitation back home, is that turning towards my own pain, turning towards my own story allows me to fully embody who I was created to be. And I cannot, like physiologically, we really cannot take people where we are not going, right? So for me, for example, as a therapist, let's say I have a client and they're super anxious because maybe some really hard things happened and they're just feeling these feelings. If I'm living outside of myself, my ability to attend to them is, I don't have much. I will not have the capacity. I don't have the resources. I don't have the internal self to offer them. And so I think of folks who are listening and it's like, I think we've got this idea in our Western culture that information changes people.
Right.
But information can only take us so far. What we know about the brain and our body is that it's a lived experience that changes us, right? And I think it's so fascinating how in the Bible, there's so much about living. There's so much about incarnation. Even just that, for me, there's a constant touch point of looking at that Jesus lived in a body. Like, can you imagine being in the presence of Jesus? Like I wonder sometimes if that was just as healing, like we don't get to hear about that as much because it's not words, but what we know is that presence changes us.
Right.
And oftentimes our words, if we can anchor our words in our presence, in our lived experience, in our vulnerable and yet appropriate, right? Like, because when you're talking with folks, sure, you don't have to share every single hard thing that you're going through in your life, but you also don't have to white knuckle it.
Yes.
You also don't have to pretend. You also, and I think we actually do people a disservice when we do that because they don't have access to you either. Not only do you not have access to them, they don't have access to you.
Right. And
so I think, so for folks listening, I think it's a valid fear. It makes sense. That's okay. That would be a worry. And yet what we know about how people really grow is that one moment of true presence is worth as all the Bible facts. Like if they feel like if they're outside of their window of tolerance, so if they're outside of the range of arousal that they can feel in a way that doesn't feel too overwhelming, information does not process in our brains when that happens.
Yeah.
And so, gosh, for anyone who's listening, I just would want to encourage you that this is an invitation to turn towards your fears, your story with compassion, knowing that is God's posture to us. And your modeling of that is a whole sermon.
Yes.
That's a year's worth.
Yes. That's so good. I mean, I think again, the power of presence, in the Old Testament, this was the thing that they kept coming back to. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. It was a place where they could almost feel seen and known and not white knuckle. And I think so much of life and what you talked about just a second ago is so helpful because it made me think of the importance of language and what we often tell ourselves to anchor ourselves. And often I can feel a sense of exhale or peace or freedom, but then the words that I'm telling myself are words of a white knuckling spirit. And so when you talk about this kind of dance, when you talk about this kind of anchoring, are there certain phrases that you come back to? Are there certain words that you're like, no? And obviously try softer was one I've just been like, it's been helpful for me just in a sense of, or be kind to yourself. I've just been like, hey, nobody else has had to go through what you've had to go through. There's no map here. So why are you putting so much pressure on yourself? Just be okay. But are there phrases that almost get you back into your body, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think I might just build on that just a little.
Please, yes.
One of the ways that I contextualize some of this work for people is to say, and this is where the compassion continues to be helpful, is to ask the question, like, let's say you have this ruminating voice in your head that's like, oh, but I can't believe you didn't make those last 5 calls, or you should have got more done today, or all the other pastors did that, whatever that is. And one of the things that has been really helpful for me to learn that comes from what I would call a trauma-informed lens, meaning just a holistic lens of how our bodies and our experiences in our life inform how we show up in the world now, and how that includes our nervous system, and just being aware of all those things, is to ask the question, how has this kept me safe?
Wow.
Like for me, how has white knuckling, how has suppressing my needs, how has over accommodating people, how has pushing hard all the time, how has not giving myself permission to rest, how has that kept me safe?
Wow.
And not only has it kept me safe, but why have I needed it? And so, folks who are listening, there's probably a whole range of stories. Maybe some folks who are listening really came from a family where there's potentially some significant trauma. But even if you didn't, even if you just were raised in the culture that we live in, you've probably internalized messages about your value and your worth in the culture we live in. And so for me, it's helpful because then I can say to that voice, I can say to the voice who's like, well, Aundi, you should have, so-and-so got this done, and they have more on their plate than you do. Who do you think? Like, why are you so lazy or whatever? For me to be able to say like, I hear you, like I hear you, voice. And I know that when I was a child, I literally, to be able to have value, hustled real hard to just because attention was a slim commodity. And so to get any of the attention was to have to stand out. And there was no room for my pain. There wasn't room for me to have a hard day. There wasn't room for me to not be okay. So I had to be okay all the time, even when things were profoundly not okay. And so I can look back at that part of myself and say, you know what? I know that used to be true. And I thank you so much. Like, you've kept me safe. You've allowed me to get where I am. But now I'm a 38-year-old woman, and I have different resources, and I have different choices. And that's not true for me anymore. Like, what I know now is that I am beloved. I know I have people in my life who, if I say I can't get another thing done because I am burned out, like I can't, and they will say, you know what, that makes sense, and let's figure out what you need, and that's the difference, is that when my present day self can turn towards that younger part of myself who had to have that strategy to survive, can help them begin to say like, hey, I know it feels like an emergency. It's not. Like, you are safe now.
Yeah.
Or you don't need to do that anymore. And so for me, that allows that voice, and it's not magic, it's sometimes we have to work with that part of ourselves, but it can help us to begin to soften.
Yes.
So we can receive that.
I feel like I need to Venmo you money right now. This is not a podcast. This just became Breaking Your Sabbath and Sabbatical. Holy cow, this is so good. Okay, back to what you just said. On page 12, you say, the work of trying softer begins when we release our desire for the quick fix and tend to the wounds underneath the surface. Otherwise, we're going to stay stuck. And you, again, just what you just modeled, but you use the word tend. And I think it's embodies what you just kind of walked through. And again, I don't try and tend. And I think there's so many of us, we don't tend. And I think we do stay stuck. And we stay stuck, and we communicate with harsher, with stronger supposed language. And since we don't have access to that part of ourself, we can't love ourselves. which doesn't allow us to love our neighbor. And then our sermons don't actually help. And so I'm you've sat through a number of sermons, I imagine, and I think there's this piece right now where I'm thinking, gosh, like 2020 had to be the hardest year for the majority of pastors and the majority of humans on so many levels, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, all of it. And I think so many pastors are just white knuckling it through. And they're now coming to a level of fatigue that they had pre-COVID. And they just, whether civil unrest, whether politically, whether their body tensed up and like, we gotta keep, and just go. And then I sit there and I go, gosh, by them not doing their work, all of these people are longing for a healthy guide. And so I think in one sense, I'd love just to hear your thoughts and what would you want from a pastor? What would you want from just the kind of person? Because as my buddy Steve Cuss says, he says that a great therapist and a great pastor and a great spiritual director, they all want the same thing. They want transformation, peace, freedom, and love. Like they want to lead you to that. And so, which I've just have not been able to stop thinking about. If a good therapist isn't leading you towards more understanding of peace and freedom and love and transformation, that's probably not a healthy therapist. And the same thing with a pastor. So I guess from your experience and what you see, what would be themes? And I feel like there's a number of them that you dropped that spoke to me from Try Softer, but yeah, are there any that just stand out to you?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, so many thoughts. I think, I'll just to be honest, I mean, church has been complicated for me for a lot of my life. I've known and, I've walked with Jesus my whole life. There's never been a time that I haven't known Jesus. And yet, I've known trauma my whole life too, or that's been a part of my life. And so I say that because I speak from this unique location of like, I name that partly for myself, that I always come from this place of that I am a trauma survivor. And so that affects the lens, And so I share that because I think the most helpful pastors that I've experienced, for me, there's usually a sense of, one is humility, for sure. Mm-hmm. Is that there is just this sense of humility leaves room to say, you know what, like this is how I understand God today and what I bring to this space. And I know that there are things that I don't know. And I honor that. I mean, I have had experiences, and believe me when I say I've known some amazing pastors. I've seen some beautiful, beautiful desire to really do inner work. So just, I want to balance this out. But I mean, I remember we were trying out this one church and my friend introduced me to the head pastor and said, Aundi's a therapist. He had done a sermon on anxiety. And he said, my friend said to the pastor, Aundi as a licensed therapist. And he said, oh, you probably learned a few things today. And so, I mean, we didn't go back, because for me, it's like, I mean, I've spent a lot of time, energy, lived experience doing this work. And so I think like, for me, I'm like that's a profound lack of humility in that area, and so, but on the contrary, like I think there are people where there are times in sermons where I'll hear something and I'm like, it makes me I squirm. But then the person says, they leave some room. Like they talk about it in a way that says, maybe, maybe this is something that that you're seeing differently in your life right now. Or maybe, I don't know, like there's just, obviously it depends on the topic you're talking about. But I think for me, I always feel this sense of like, thanks.
Yes.
Because for me as a trauma-informed therapist, one of my high values is to empower clients to know what's going on with them and in their own body. Like it's not my job to say, hey, here's your 3 things that you need to go do in your life. Actually, my job is to return power, to share power, to say, you are a human made in the image of God and you have embedded wisdom in your body. Let's help you tap into what you already know. Yeah. And I have the privilege to midwife you as you walk through the process of knowing like what's already yours, And so I think that humility piece is huge. And then I think for me, the other part is really a coming back to the innate value, because I think it's such attachment work. And I feel like we lose that a lot. That's where we start going into like, hey, let me just tell you how to white knuckle it out here. But we can't risk out here if we don't have a home base. If I don't know that when I go out and I fall flat on my face, that God is like, I got you. Like I have got you. Like your value has never been about what you did and performed for me. So come back and rest and be nourished and cared for. And I think those are the 2 biggest things that when I see that high emphasis in those areas, I think there's room for so many other things, because it allows me to know, like, 1, you're approachable. Like if this didn't hit right, because it, like, for me as someone who has, quite a bit of knowledge in the trauma arena, like I have antenna, like I hear things and I'm like, okay, maybe we could say that differently kind of thing. So those are the 2 big things.
That's amazing. I seriously, this has been so good. And I feel like there's so many places. I feel like I've written down quotes after quotes after quotes from your book, and I've only said one of them. One thing I do want to say about this book though, is what's so great is I love that, on the sides of the book, there are these moments, and at the end of the chapters, just questions. And it was just helpful for me because, again, I feel like I am, and I think a lot of pastors are like Fisher Price when it comes to these conversations of like therapy, and I've been doing my work and trying, but like I just feel like the moments just to step back. It was there was a guide, and I saw on Instagram recently that there's like a next level that you're releasing. Can you just talk about that? Because I actually think it would be so helpful to so many of my friends who I think are beginning this conversation, but just need some deeper help or kinder help.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. So it's called the Try Softer Guided Journey, a soulful companion to healing. And so it really is a companion book to Try Softer. And it's kind of, the angle that I tried to take with the guided journey is like, essentially like almost like a deeper dive. Because I cover a lot of ideas in Try Softer.
You do.
Yeah, it's a lot. I sometimes joke, I was like, it's kind of like herding cats a little bit. And initially, until I felt like I felt like I found Try Softer is what brought it all together, essentially. Right. But there were all these ideas because this is how I do therapy. These are all the things. And I was trying to figure out, how do I bring it into one cohesive idea almost. And so the guided journey is almost like, this is where I would go with you, with a person, if we were in therapy and it was like, okay, let's break this. Like I know you see the big picture, so let's get a little bit more particular. let's get a little bit more granular with your story, and not just like knowing about the ideas, but how can we help you anchor that even more in your body, in your story, in your like, so it's integrated and not just another idea.
That's amazing. Now, when does that release?
That releases October 5th.
October 5th. Oh my goodness. What a great resource. Because again, just for so many pastors who you find yourself going, I don't necessarily know how to do this. And again, if you ever feel like you have to play therapist, no, that's outside your pay grade. Like that to recommend, it's the thing I constantly want to remind you. Some of us are really, really gifted at exegeting Greek and Hebrew, but trauma is not what we've studied in. And so when you meet people like Aundi and others, please, you don't have to care for it. The best way you can care is direct them towards people who can shepherd and tend to those wounds well. And so, but I love that this resource for me selfishly, but also for me as a means to reach out. You're also amazing on social media. My wife and I love following you because I just feel like the things that you drop are just things that I will just spend that day thinking about. Where can people find you?
Yeah. So both on Instagram and Twitter at Aundi Kolber.
Awesome. Super, super easy. Friends, do what you can. Please buy Try Softer, read it. If you don't like it, you can email me at steve@steveryancarter. I'll pay you because I guarantee you're going to like it. But I will say this though, even just in 40 minutes, the ground that you've covered, you have a really, really, really amazing way at language. And the way that you just talked about empower to return power, that's really, really beautiful. It makes me think of when I'm writing and crafting a sermon, one of the ways that, and I've never used that language, to return power, to return that agency. But it's that piece of, are my words actually creating this space for them to sit and go, oh, I've got some agency here. And I'm going to walk away thinking about that, thinking about fawning and going, oh my goodness, how often I do this. But I'd also love to hear from you all listening. What stood out to you, whether in the book Try Softer or just from some of the wisdom that Aundi shared today, and maybe for you specifically from a pastoral side, where do you find the white knuckling? Where do you find that sense of fawning or freezing in you? Where do you find that side of just taking power rather than returning it? We want to walk with you in whatever way we can with the Craft and Character team. And you can always reach out. My email again is steve@steveryancarter.com, or follow us on social media. But friends, you don't have to do this alone. Your craft matters, but it's really about your character. And I hope that this week, some of the things that Aundi shared, you'll be able to just listen to what's actually going on in your body, and that you will be able to kind of return to that anchored point of Christ and allow him to do what he can do to make you free, to bring you peace, and to help you experience true transformation so that you can truly love your neighbor well as you love yourself. Much love, everyone. Grace and peace. And thank you very much, Aundi, for joining us.